Surgeon Louis Albert Sayre observes the change in the curvature of a patient's spine as she self-suspends herself prior to being wrapped in a plaster of Paris bandage as a treatment for a spinal deformity. Circa 1870s, a young patient appears suspended above the ground while a physician watches closely. There is no modern operating room, no sophisticated medical equipment, and none of the technology we now associate with spinal medicine. Instead, the scene is dominated by a simple support apparatus, careful observation, and the promise of a remarkable idea. Perhaps the shape of a human spine could be changed by temporarily taking weight away from the body and then holding the corrected position in plaster. The physician standing beside the patient was Dr. Louis Albert Sayre, one of the most influential figures in 19th century American orthopedic surgery. The photograph belongs to a period when doctors were only beginning to understand spinal deformities scientifically. Today, conditions such as scoliosis can be examined with advanced imaging and treated using highly developed orthopedic techniques. In Sayre's era, physicians had far fewer tools. A doctor often had to rely on physical examination, observation, anatomical knowledge, and sometimes nothing more than his own hands. And this is what makes the photograph so fascinating. It is not simply a picture of a patient receiving treatment. It is a record of a moment when medicine was experimenting with an entirely new way of thinking about the spine. Louis Albert Sayre was born in 1820 and eventually became a prominent surgeon in New York. He was associated with Bellevue Hospital and became America's first professor of orthopedic surgery. His career included work on numerous disorders of the bones, joints, and muscles, but spinal disease became one of the areas for which he was particularly remembered. During the 19th century, spinal deformities presented physicians with a difficult problem. Some patients developed noticeable curvature of the spine during childhood or adolescence. Others suffered from diseases that affected the vertebrae and gradually altered the shape and stability of the spinal column. Doctors had attempted many forms of support and correction. Braces, rigid devices, and various forms of external restraint had been used, but these approaches had limitations. Sayre became convinced that something more dynamic could be attempted. His method involved suspension. The basic concept was strikingly simple. If the patient's body could be partially supported from above, the effects of gravity and the body's own weight could temporarily change the position of the trunk. Sayre believed that this altered position could then be maintained by applying a plaster of Paris bandage around the torso. The plaster would harden into a rigid support. The technique became known as the Sayre plaster jacket. By the 1870s, Sayre was demonstrating this approach publicly and documenting his cases. His 1877 book, Spinal Disease and Spinal Curvature, Their Treatment by Suspension and the Use of the Plaster of Paris Bandage, contained 21 photographs and numerous illustrations showing patients before, during, and after treatment. That book is extraordinarily important because it allows us to see 19th century orthopedic medicine through the eyes of the physician himself. The photograph that inspired this story belongs to that world. The patient is positioned so that her body can be partially supported, while Sayre observes the change in the curvature of her spine. The purpose was not merely to make the patient appear straighter for a photograph. The temporary change in position was part of Sayre's therapeutic theory. Once the body had been placed in what Sayre considered a more favorable position, the plaster bandage could be applied. The procedure required careful coordination. The patient had to remain positioned while assistants worked around the torso. Plaster bandages were wrapped around the body, creating a rigid external shell. When the material hardened, it formed what became known as a plaster jacket. It is important to understand this photograph in its historical context. 19th century medicine did not possess the diagnostic tools available today, and many of the assumptions surrounding spinal deformities were incomplete. Modern medicine does not consider Sayre's method a universal solution for scoliosis, and the long-term effectiveness of such historical treatments was limited and variable. Yet his work contributed to the development of orthopedic casting and bracing techniques. There is another remarkable aspect to the story. Sayre did not simply describe his method in words, he photographed it.
Photography was still a relatively young technology. A medical photograph required considerable preparation, controlled lighting, a suitable camera, and a patient willing to participate in a process that could be uncomfortable and unfamiliar. These images therefore served a purpose beyond illustration. They were evidence. They allowed Sayre to compare the appearance of a patient's body before treatment with its appearance after suspension and casting. In several of his documented cases, he carefully recorded changes that he believed demonstrated improvement. One of the cases in his 1877 book involved a young patient named Lizzie Wolfe, who was 16 years old. Sayre recorded that her spinal curvature had developed during adolescence and had progressed rapidly. After she was photographed, she underwent suspension and received a plaster bandage. Sayre reported improvements in her comfort and certain physical measurements, and another photograph was taken afterward. Other cases were documented with similar sequences. The photographs could show a patient before treatment, during suspension, and after the plaster jacket had been applied. In one documented case, Sayre even emphasized how small technical mistakes in positioning or applying the bandage could affect the result. That detail reveals something important about 19th century medicine. Doctors were not simply experimenting blindly, they were beginning to develop systematic methods of observation, documentation, comparison, and publication. Their conclusions were often imperfect, but the process itself was becoming increasingly scientific. Sayre's work also spread beyond the United States. In 1877, while visiting Britain, he demonstrated his methods in hospitals and before medical audiences. Contemporary medical literature took notice of his work, and his book was published in London that same year. The photograph therefore represents much more than an unusual medical scene from the 1870s. It captures a turning point. A physician is standing beside a patient, watching the human spine change position under controlled suspension. Around them are the tools of an era before modern imaging, before sophisticated surgical instrumentation, and before the standardized orthopedic treatments familiar today. And yet, the fundamental medical question is surprisingly modern. Can the body be carefully repositioned, supported, and given a chance to heal? Sayre believed the answer could be yes. His plaster jacket would not solve every spinal disorder, and some of his theories would later be revised or rejected. But his experiments helped establish an important principle in orthopedic history. External support could be used not merely to protect the body, but to influence its position and function. More than 150 years later, the photograph remains powerful because it freezes that experiment in time. The patient's identity may be less famous than the physician's, but she occupies the center of the story. Her posture, the apparatus, the doctor's concentration, and the surrounding medical environment reveal how radically different healthcare once looked. There are no computer screens, no x rays, no MRI scans, no modern operating theater. Only a doctor, a patient, a mechanical support, plaster, and an idea. And that idea became one of the early chapters in the long history of treating spinal deformities. The photograph survives because medicine, unlike memory, can leave traces. A single image from the 1870s allows us to look into a room where physicians were testing the limits of what they understood about the human body. Louis Albert Sayre wanted to change the way spinal disease was treated. He could not see the future of orthopedic medicine, but for a brief moment, suspended above the floor, his patient became part of an experiment that would be recorded, published, debated, and remembered. And that is why this strange photograph is far more than an image from the past. It is a snapshot of medicine learning how to become modern.